The rain came down in a steady, miserable drizzle, coating the empty streets in a thin sheen of water. The occasional street lamp flickered, casting ghostly reflections on the pavement. It was the kind of night that made people hurry home, seeking warmth and shelter. Officer Jake Reynolds sighed as he guided his patrol car down the nearly deserted road. His shift was almost over, and all he wanted was a hot cup of coffee and a few hours of sleep before doing it all over again. The police scanner crackled with routine updates, but nothing urgent. Just another quiet, damp evening in this small town. Then he saw it, a small shape, barely visible in the dim glow of his headlights, hunched near the curb. At first, he thought it was a discarded bag or a pile of rags, but as he got closer, the shape moved. A puppy. Jake slowed the car and pulled over. The little creature was covered in mud, its fur matted and clumped together from the rain. It shivered violently, its tiny ribs visible beneath its wet coat. But what struck Jake the most was a look in its eyes, pleading, desperate, as if it had been waiting for someone to notice. Stepping out of the cruiser, Jake crouched low, extending a hand. "Hey, little guy," he murmured. The puppy flinched at first, then hesitated, as if torn between fear and the desperate need for help. Carefully, Jake reached into his pocket and pulled out the half-eaten sandwich he had planned to finish on his way home. The puppy's nose twitched. Hunger won over hesitation. With slow, cautious steps, it crept forward and snatched a small bite, chewing frantically. "That's it," Jake said softly. "You're okay now." As he scooped the trembling pup into his arms, he felt it press into him, its tiny heartbeat hammering against his chest. But something was off. The puppy wasn't just scared. It was fixated on something. Its head turned toward a narrow dirt road leading into the woods, ears perked, body tense. Jake followed its gaze. A shiver ran down his spine. The path, barely visible in the rain, twisted into darkness, leading to a forgotten part of town. And something about it felt wrong. Jake exhaled, his breath visible in the cold night air. He glanced down at the puppy, still nestled against his chest, its frail body radiating warmth despite the damp chill. But it wasn't settling in. It kept twisting, ears pricked toward the path, whimpering softly. Something was out there. Most people would chalk it up to a stray's instincts. Maybe it had lived nearby. Maybe it was just nervous. But Jake had been a cop long enough to trust his gut, and right now, it was telling him that this wasn't just a lost puppy looking for a home. "All right," he muttered, securing the pup under his jacket to keep it warm. "Let's see what's got you so worked up." He reached for his radio, pressing the button. "Dispatch. This is Officer Reynolds. I'm stepping out on foot to investigate an abandoned road off Crestview Drive. Possible abandoned animal. I'll check in soon." A crackle, then the dispatcher's voice. "Copy that, Reynolds. Be careful. Weather's turning worse." Jake clicked off the radio and adjusted his grip on his flashlight. The rain had softened the dirt path into thick mud, each step sinking slightly as he made his way forward. The trees arched overhead, their skeletal branches forming a tunnel, swallowing what little light came from the street. The deeper he went, the more the town disappeared behind him. Houses that had once lined this area had long since been abandoned, their broken remains barely visible through the undergrowth. The puppy squirmed again. Jake's grip tightened. "Easy, bud. I've got you." The dog let out a tiny, anxious yelp. Jake flicked his flashlight ahead. That's when he saw it. A house. It stood at the end of the overgrown path, hunched like a forgotten relic. The structure was weathered, its wooden siding warped and peeling. Windows gaped like empty sockets, and the front door, slightly ajar, shifted ever so slightly in the wind, creaking softly. Jake stopped. His heartbeat picked up. He'd seen enough abandoned places to know that sometimes they weren't as empty as they seemed. The puppy let out a sharp whimper, squirming harder. Something was inside. Jake took a slow breath, reaching instinctively for his service weapon. His training took over. Years on the force had taught him to trust what others might ignore. He moved forward cautiously, boots crunching against the gravel-strewn path leading to the porch. The puppy, still tucked beneath his jacket, suddenly tensed. Its entire body went rigid. Jake's pulse hammered in his ears. Then, From deep inside the house, so faint he almost thought he imagined it, came a sound. A whimper, not from the puppy. From something or someone else. The old wooden steps groaned under Jake's weight as he ascended the porch. His grip tightened around his flashlight, its narrow beam cutting through the suffocating darkness inside. The door, warped from years of neglect, hung slightly open, swaying just enough to send an eerie creak into the night. The puppy, still tucked against his chest, trembled violently. Jake exhaled slowly. He'd been in abandoned buildings before. Squatters, junkies, and runaway teens often sought shelter in places like this. But this house felt different. Something was wrong. Pushing the door open with his shoulder, he stepped inside. The scent hit him first, a mix of mildew, damp wood, and something foul lurking beneath it. The air was heavy, stagnant, as if the house had been holding its breath. His flashlight flickered across the room. Dust-coated furniture sat in eerie stillness, as if frozen in time. A tattered couch leaned awkwardly to one side, stuffing spilling from its seams. Old newspapers lay scattered on the floor, their pages yellowed and brittle. But what made Jake's skin prickle was the kitchen table. It was still set. Plates, forks, and cups rested in place, though they were coated in dust. A single chair lay toppled over, as if someone had stood up too quickly. It was as if the people who lived here had simply vanished in the middle of a meal, never to return. The puppy suddenly wriggled against him, letting out a soft whimper. Jake stiffened. He wasn't alone. He swept the beam of his flashlight across the room again, pausing near the hallway that led deeper into the house. The door at the end was slightly ajar, and that's when he heard it, a faint rustling, barely a sound, just enough to make the fine hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Jake's fingers flexed over the grip of his weapon. Carefully, he made his way down the hall, moving slow, silent. Every creak beneath his boots felt deafening in the stillness. Then, another noise. This time it was more distinct. A whimper. Weak. Muffled. His flashlight beam landed on a door to his left. Old, chipped paint. A rusted handle. The puppy squirmed violently. Jake's heartbeat thudded as he reached for the knob, testing it carefully. Locked. But something or someone was behind that door. With a deep breath, he braced himself and kicked hard. Though it splintered, the door crashing open. The flashlight beam pierced the darkness. And then Jake saw them. Two small figures. Huddled in the corner. Wide, terrified eyes staring up at him. Jake froze. The beam of his flashlight trembled slightly as his mind caught up with what his eyes were seeing. Two children, thin, filthy, and clutching each other in the corner of the small, windowless room. A boy and a girl. The girl, who looked no older than 5, shrank against a wall, her tangled blonde hair half covering her gaunt face. The boy, slightly older, positioned himself in front of her protectively, his arms wrapped tightly around her shoulders. Their clothes were torn, stained with dirt, their bare feet red from cold. But it was their eyes that hit Jake the hardest. Wide, hollow, haunted. They had been here for a long time. Jake immediately crouched, lowering his flashlight so it wouldn't blind them. "Hey there," he said, keeping his voice calm, soft. "It's okay. I'm a police officer. You're safe now." The boy flinched at the word police, gripping his sister tighter. Jake's stomach twisted. What had they been told? Who had left them here? The puppy squirmed again, then let out a small, pitiful whine. The little girl's eyes flickered to it, a spark of recognition in the hollow emptiness of her gaze. Jake saw his chance. He slowly unzipped his jacket, letting the puppy wriggle free onto the floor. It shook itself off, then padded hesitantly toward the children, its tiny tail wagging. The girl let out a breath, a small, broken sound, and reached out a trembling hand. The puppy licked her fingers. A tear slipped down her dirty cheek. Jake swallowed hard and lowered himself further, making himself less threatening. "Did you send him to find help?" he asked gently. The boy's lips pressed together, but something flickered in his expression. He had. Jake exhaled slowly, his heart pounding. "You're really brave," he told the boy. "Both of you." The boy's arms tightened protectively around his sister, but his lips parted slightly, as if he wanted to say something but didn't trust himself to speak. Jake didn't rush him. Instead, he glanced around the room. It was barely a room at all, more like a storage space. No bed, no blankets, just piles of old junk pushed against the walls. A single, rusted bucket sat in the corner. Jake clenched his jaw. Someone had left them here, trapped them, and from the looks of it, they had been surviving on almost nothing. His voice was steady when he spoke again. "Is there anyone else here?" The boy hesitated, then shook his head. Jake nodded. "Okay, we're going to get you both out of here." He reached for his radio with one hand while extending the other toward them. "Come on, let's get you somewhere warm." The girl hesitated, eyes flicking from the puppy to Jake's outstretched hand. The boy was still stiff, still wary, but something in him shifted. Then, slowly, cautiously, he moved, pulling his sister with him. Their small, fragile fingers slipped into Jake's hand. Jake let out a quiet breath of relief. He clicked his radio. "Dispatch! This is Officer Reynolds. I need immediate backup and medical assistance at an abandoned property off Crestview Drive. 2 children found alive." A crackle. Then, "Copy that, Reynolds. Sending units now." Jake looked back at the children, his grip firm but gentle around their hands. "You're safe now," he promised. But in his gut, he knew this wasn't over. Who had done this? And where were they now? Jake kept his grip on the children's hands as he guided them out of the small, suffocating room. The boy hesitated at the threshold, his body still tense, as if expecting someone, to stop them. The girl clung to her brother, her tiny fingers wrapped around his arm. The puppy trotted alongside them, its small tail wagging uncertainly as it stayed close to the children's feet. Jake's pulse remained steady, but his mind was racing. The house was too quiet, too still. Whoever had kept these children here had left them behind. But why? And for how long? He kept his flashlight low as they stepped back into the main hallway, his other hand still resting lightly on his holstered weapon. He wasn't taking any chances. "You're doing great," he told them softly. "Just a little farther." The boy kept glancing around, his eyes darting into the shadows, his steps reluctant. Jake crouched slightly, lowering himself to the boy's level. "Hey," he said gently, "is there something I need to know?" The boy hesitated, his throat working as he swallowed. Then, in a voice so small Jake almost didn't catch it, he whispered, "They come back sometimes." Jake's stomach tightened. "Who?" he pressed, keeping his tone even. The boy's gaze flickered toward the front door, then back to Jake. He didn't answer. That was all Jake needed to know. He straightened, his senses now on full alert. He needed to get these kids out of here now. The front door was only a few steps away. Rain still drizzled outside, the wind whistling through the broken window panes. Jake tightened his hold on the children's hands as they crossed the threshold, stepping onto the porch. Then, a noise, a low metallic clank, followed by the faintest creak of wood from somewhere behind them. Jake didn't hesitate. He scooped the little girl into his arms, gripping the boy's hand tighter as he moved swiftly down the steps. The puppy followed, scampering after them. They were halfway to the patrol car when headlights suddenly cut through the darkness. A vehicle, coming fast. Jake's heart slammed against his ribs. The boy stiffened beside him, his entire body going rigid. "It's them," the boy choked out. Jake didn't wait. He reached for his radio with one hand, the other wrapping securely around the child's wrist. "Dispatch! I've got a vehicle approaching fast. Possible suspect connected to child endangerment. Need backup now." A burst of static. Then, units en route. ETA 4 minutes. They didn't have 4 minutes. The vehicle skidded to a stop just down the road. The headlights burned brightly, blinding against the rain. The engine idled. A long, suffocating silence followed. Then, the driver's side door opened. A shadow stepped out. Jake immediately shifted, positioning the children behind him. His hand went to his weapon, but he didn't draw. Not yet. The puppy let out a low whimper, pressing against the boy's leg. Jake squared his stance. "Stay behind me," he told him firmly. The figure moved closer, slow, deliberate. Jake tightened his grip on his weapon. "Police," he called out. Step into the light, and keep your hands where I can see them." The figure hesitated. Then, with eerie calm, they stepped forward. Jake's blood ran cold. He knew that face, and he knew this wasn't over. Jake's breath hitched for a fraction of a second. He had seen this man before. Pale, gaunt, with hollowed-out eyes that didn't quite meet his. The man's clothes were damp from the rain, his hands tucked into the pockets of a heavy jacket. There was something about the way he moved, slow, calculating, that sent a ripple of unease through Jake's spine. The boy behind him whimpered. Jake didn't turn. He kept his stance firm, positioning himself between the children and the approaching figure. His hand rested on his holstered weapon, but he didn't draw it just yet. "Step into the light," Jake ordered again, his voice steady, controlled. The man took another slow step forward. Then he stopped. A flicker of something, recognition, amusement, crossed his face. "Officer Reynolds," he murmured, his voice rough. "Didn't expect to see you here." Jake's grip tightened. He did know this man. Jonathan Miller, a name that had been buried in old case files. Years ago, Jonathan had been questioned in connection to a missing persons case. Nothing had ever stuck, and without evidence, he had faded into the background. A ghost, but now he was here. And Jake didn't believe in coincidences. "Keep your hands where I can see them," Jake warned. Jonathan's lips twitched into something that wasn't quite a smile. His fingers twitched at his sides, but he didn't reach for anything. "Relax, officer. I just came for what's mine." Jake felt the children tense behind him. The boy's fingers dug into his sleeve. What exactly would that be? Jake asked, though he already knew the answer. Jonathan's head tilted slightly. He let out a slow breath, as if he had all the time in the world. "The kids," he said. "They belong to me." A surge of cold anger swept through Jake. He could feel the little girl pressing against his back, hear the soft, terrified breaths of her brother. "You abandoned them," Jake said, keeping his tone level. "Locked them in a room like animals." Jonathan's expression didn't change. "That's not your concern." "See, that's where you're wrong," Jake countered. "Because child endangerment? That is my concern." Jonathan sighed. "You don't understand." Jake pulled his weapon. The motion was smooth, practiced, the weight of the gun steady in his hands. The moment Jonathan saw it, his expression flickered. Just for a second. "I understand plenty," Jake said. "You're not leaving here with them." For the first time, something dark surfaced in Jonathan's gaze. The tension thickened. The wind howled through the trees. Then suddenly, Jonathan took a step back. Jake's pulse pounded in his ears. He kept his stance firm, his finger hovering near the trigger. Then, tires screeched in the distance. The glow of flashing red and blue lights cut through the stormy night. Backup had arrived. Jonathan's jaw clenched. He knew he was out of time. For a second, Jake thought he might run. But instead, Jonathan lifted both hands slowly into the air. A smirk played at his lips. "Guess we'll have to finish this conversation another time." Jake ignored the taunt. "Get on your knees. Hands behind your head." Jonathan obeyed. The moment his knees hit the dirt, Jake moved in, securing his cuffs around the man's wrists. Relief flooded him. But even as he secured Jonathan's arrest, one thought nagged at him. What exactly had this man been planning to do tonight? And more importantly, who else was involved? The rain drummed against the asphalt as the flashing red and blue lights painted eerie shadows across the abandoned house. Backup officers moved quickly, securing the scene while paramedics ushered the children into the warmth of an ambulance. The little girl clung to the puppy as a paramedic wrapped a thermal blanket around her small shoulders. Jake kept his focus on Jonathan Miller. Even in cuffs, sitting on the wet ground, Jonathan looked disturbingly calm. His lips curled slightly, like he was enjoying a private joke. Jake crouched beside him, his voice low and firm. "Start talking. Why were those kids locked in that house?" Jonathan exhaled slowly, tilting his head toward the sky. "You wouldn't understand," he murmured. Jake's patience thinned. He knew men like this, detached, self-assured, believing they were untouchable. But something in Jonathan's tone set off an alarm in Jake's gut. "Try me." Jonathan finally turned his gaze to Jake. "You think you saved them tonight?" he asked, voice almost amused. "You're too late." Jake's jaw tightened. "Too late for what?" Jonathan didn't answer. Instead, he let out a low chuckle. "You really don't get it, do you?" Before Jake could push further, one of the responding officers called out, "Reynolds, you're going to want to see this." Jake shot Jonathan one last hard look before standing. "We're not done." Jonathan's smirk didn't waver. Jake turned and followed the officer back toward the house. Near the front steps, another cop held a rusted metal lock in his gloved hand. "Found this in the backyard," he said. "It's been cut clean through." Jake frowned. The kids were locked in from the outside. "Looks like it," the officer confirmed, "which means someone put them there and left." A chill crawled up Jake's spine. If Jonathan had locked them in, why would the boy say that someone came back sometimes? Something wasn't adding up. Just then, the radio on his belt crackled. "Reynolds, we just ran Miller's name. You're going to want to hear this." Jake pressed the receiver. "Go ahead." There was a pause. Then, "He's not their father." Jake's stomach dropped. Miller's got no legal ties to those kids. No birth records, no custody papers. Nothing. Jake's eyes flicked back to the ambulance, where the boy sat stiffly beside his sister. Then who were they to him? His radio crackled again. And one more thing. Miller was flagged in an ongoing investigation, a suspected trafficking ring. Jake's breath caught. His pulse pounded as he turned back to Jonathan, who was watching him with that same infuriating smirk. "You figured it out," Jonathan said smoothly. Jake's fingers curled into fists. He had dealt with criminals before, burglars, drug dealers, even murderers. But this was worse. "You took them," Jake said coldly. Jonathan tilted his head slightly, as if considering. "Not me," he corrected. "I just handle logistics." Jake's stomach twisted. The implications were clear. And suddenly, everything clicked. The empty house. The children locked inside. The cut lock. Someone had come back. Someone who had realized the cops were sniffing too close. They had abandoned the kids. They had left them to die. Jonathan might be in cuffs. But Jake knew the truth. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The rain had slowed to a light drizzle by the time Jonathan Miller was loaded into the back of a squad car. He didn't resist. He didn't fight. He simply sat there, staring out the window, that smirk still faintly tugging at his lips. But Jake saw for what it was. A mask. Miller had lost control tonight, and he knew it. Still, an uneasy feeling lingered in Jake's chest. He had no doubt that Miller was just a small piece of something much larger. The trafficking ring, whoever they were, had slipped away, leaving only these two children behind. And if there were others, Jake exhaled sharply. He wasn't going to let this go. He turned toward the ambulance, where the boy sat with his arms wrapped protectively around his sister. The little girl had finally fallen asleep, curled up against his chest, her tiny hand still clutching the puppy's fur. Jake approached slowly. The boy's wary eyes followed him, still full of fear, uncertainty. But Jake crouched beside him, offering a small, reassuring nod. "You're safe now." The boy hesitated, his grip tightening around his sister. Jake could only imagine what these kids had been through. The fear, the confusion, the feeling of being discarded like they didn't matter. But they did. He softened his voice. "I know you don't trust me yet," he admitted. "And that's okay. But I promise you, I'm going to find out who did this. And I won't let them hurt anyone else." The boy studied him for a long moment. Then, slowly, cautiously, he gave the smallest nod. Jake's throat tightened. He stood, watching as the paramedics prepared to transport the children to the hospital for evaluation. A social worker had already been contacted, but Jake knew these kids needed more than just a place to stay. They needed justice. They needed someone to fight for them, and Jake intended to be that person. As the ambulance doors closed and the vehicle pulled away, Jake took one last look at the deserted house. The broken windows, the peeling paint, the silent echoes of all the horrors that had happened inside. It wasn't just an abandoned building. It was a crime scene, and it was just the beginning. Jake turned back toward his squad car, his jaw set, his mind already working. There were more answers to uncover, more people to bring to justice. And he wouldn't stop until he found them, because tonight, a stray puppy had led him to something bigger than he ever could have imagined, and he wasn't about to let it slip through his fingers.